de començar la segona jornada dels diàlegs de Sant Jordi. Avui estem molt contents de comptar amb la presència de l'escriptor anglès Pullman, l'escriptor català Sánchez Piñol i el moderador i també escriptor Ricard Ruiz Garzón. Ara mateix començaran ells. Només recordar-vos que avui tenim 3 sessions, que si us voleu quedar esteu més que convidats. A 2:15 seguirem amb el José Eduardo Agualusa, escriptor d'Angola, i el Xavier Aldecoa, que els moderarà el Jaume Sobirana, i per tancar a les 8 tindrem una xerrada entre el Fernando Aramburu, l'escriptor basc, que serà entrevistat, diguéssim, parlant a Guitart. Moltes gràcies i ara us deixo amb la Txell Bonet i el Fèlix Pons, que són els lectors que us llegiran un fragment cadascú de l'obra dels escriptors que tenim aquí perquè agafeu una mica de to. Gràcies.
La pell freda d'Albert Sánchez Piñol. Mai no som infinitament lluny d'aquells qui odiem. Per la mateixa raó, doncs, podríem creure que mai no serem absolutament a prop d'aquells qui estimem. Quan em vaig embarcar ja coneixia aquest principi atroç, però hi ha veritats que mereixen la nostra atenció i n'hi ha d'altres amb les quals no ens convenen els diàlegs. Vam tenir la primera visió de l'illa de matinada. Feia 33 dies que els dofins havien renunciat a la nostra popa i 19 que la tripulació expelia núvols de baf per la boca. Els mariners escocesos es protegien amb manyoples que pujaven fins al colze. Duien pells tan contundents que feien pensar en cossos de morsa. Per als senegalesos, aquelles latituds fredes eren un suplici i el capità tolerava que fessin servir greix de patata com a maquillatge protector a les galtes i al front. La matèria es diluïa i es filtrava pels ulls. Els queien llàgrimes, però no es queixaven mai.
Bona tarda. Llegiré un fragment del llibre de la pols de Philip Lauman, per començar. Amb Malcolm mai no havia tingut una conversa com la que va tenir tot seguit. A l'escola, en una aula de 40 alumnes, no hi havia temps per aquesta mena de coses, encara que el currículum ho permetés, encara que els professors els interessés. A casa també hauria estat fora de lloc, perquè ni el pare ni la mare llegien. Al bar es dedicava més aviat a parar l'ovella que no pas a participar en les converses. I els únics 2 amics amb qui no tenien
that he found when Dr. Ralph spoke. At first, Asta sat close on his shoulder, when she'd gone as a little ferret, when he had found himself trying, but little by little she felt easier. And before long she was sitting beside Jasper, the kind-faced marmoset, having their own quiet exchange, while the body in the library was discussed and a brief history of time touched on with weary respect.
Llegeixo ara un fragment de Brúixola Daurada.
And now a piece of Northern Lights. Dust is what makes the ellipsometer work, he said. Ah, I thought it might, but what else? What did they find out about it? In one way, the church has always been aware of it. They have been preaching about dust for centuries, only they didn't call it that name. But some years ago, a Muscovite called Boris Mikhailovich Rusakov discovered a new kind of elementary particle. Have you ever heard of electrons, photons, neutrons, and the rest? They are called elementary particles because you can't break them down any further. There's nothing inside them but themselves. Well, this new kind of particle was elementary, all right, but it was very hard to measure because it didn't react in any of the usual ways. The hardest things for Rusakov to understand was why the new particle seemed to cluster where human beings were, as if it were attracted to us, and especially to adults, children too. But not nearly so much until their demons have taken a fixed form. During the years of puberty, they begin to attract us more strongly, and it settles on them as it settles on adults. Now all discoveries of this sort, because they have a bearing on the doctrines of church, have to be announced through the magisterium in Geneva. And this discovery of Rusakov's was so unlikely and strange that the inspector from the Consistorial Court of Discipline suspected Rusakov of diabolic possession. He performed an exorcism in the laboratory. He interrogated Rusakov under the rules of the Inquisition, but finally they had to accept the fact that Rusakov wasn't lying or deceiving them. Dust really existed. That left them with the problem of deciding what it was and giving the church nature. There was only one thing they could have chosen. The magisterium decided that dust was the physical evidence for original sin. Do you know what original sin is?
Good evening, can you hear me? It's nice that we talk about fantastic genre because taking together what we've to talk and the translation look like zebras. So thank you very much for having come, and especially Albert Sánchez Piñol and Philip Pullman. I'm very glad to be here, although I can introduce them very well. I can introduce Mr. Albert Sánchez Piñol, Mr. Philip Pullman, making a Catalan pun. You can't present them, which also Catalan, it sounds like they are not very nice to look at. But in any case, it wouldn't be adequate because we've had 3 or 4 anecdotes related with language. When we prepared the text, I sent one text to Marina Espasa. I had a part of the Spanish translation said that Libro de la Oscuridad, it's Libro de la Pols, it's Book of Dust. I know why they are different, and I thought, I hope the editor isn't here, but in Spanish, Libro del Polvo, because polvo has a double meaning in Spanish. It's dust, but it's also sexual intercourse. So the Spanish title is slightly different. I can't introduce them because it's tricky, because if I introduce Albert as a writer, he would say he's an anthropologist. As I say, he's the best Catalan writer in fantastic genre. It's deontology. If I told Mr. Pullman is like he's making youth literature, he will say he doesn't do it, and for right. So they're difficult to introduce, and as you are here, you know them perfectly, so it's not necessary. So I'd rather ask the questions with elements of the presentation. So I start with them because you want to listen to them. Relating to these texts, where we've seen that there is a common point between your works, Albert and Phil, which is the reference to intolerance, to freedom of expression, which is very current, the struggle against authority and the abuse of power. All these are things that come up, and you've seen it in the Cold Skin, in the trilogy, and also in the new trilogy of the Book of Dust, in this first volume with the Beautiful Savage. So the question is, what does this genre bring to talk about such a subject which is especially realistic, or said a different way? How is the fantastic useful to you to talk about intolerance, abuse of power and authority?
I'm sorry, but there's no translation.
Very well.
Nothing's working.
Okay.
Oh.
Is it working now? Can you hear? So.
Another channel.
Okay, no problem.
I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
Right, so I'll repeat the question. In the texts we've heard, we see a connection between both works of you, which is the struggle against intolerance, abuse of power, and freedom of expression. And my question is, since we're talking of reality and fantasy, what do the tools of the fantasy bring to you? Subjects have been dealt with such realistically.
That's a good question. Thank you very much, and I apologize for the fact that I didn't have it on the right channel. Now perhaps we can start talking. Yes, fantasy as such, fantasy in itself, for me has never been particularly interesting. I read Tolkien, other books of fantasy like that when I was young, but they didn't satisfy me as an adult. The most fulfilling emotional, intellectual, political, social experiences I've had from fiction have been from realistic fiction. In my country, from Jane Austen, George Eliot, from the great Victorians, and from the great novelists of the 20th century as well. So fantasy in itself is not something which I cherish for its own sake. But when you write, when you put your characters in a particular situation, it's like conducting an experiment, a scientific experiment. You can put them on an island in the Antarctic. You can put them in the Congo. You can do all sorts of. You can take them out of the complexities of everyday life and put them into a situation, which is like it's isolating them from the irrelevancies, and making clear that all and allowing the clarity of the situation to show up more vividly. That's the reason I write in a fantastic genre.
Well, this is not working, this device, but it gives more emotion, because since I understood 70% of everything. Okay, well, I think that without fantasy it would be much more difficult to talk about all these subjects we're talking: intolerance, the difference to the other, which, by the way, I think is the big issue of the 21st century. Do we do with the other? You said at the beginning that I come from anthropology. Anthropology, the main subject is alterity, the other. How do we relate with them? The piece Txell Bonet has read out very well, by the way, is from The Cold Skin, which is a romance, a novel dealing with this, what the others are. For this, I could think of the wildest savage I've ever found, which is an anthropologic researcher. But if I want to deal with this correctly, is going beyond the wildest savage, which is inventing a fantastic element, creatures that are the limit of humanity as we know him. So the question with such a novel is, what do we do with the other? Is it a monster? Is it a monster? Is it not? So the fantastic element is top, because you can manage this much more easily. I have always said it. The monster as such helps us reflect about the us, and this is the advantage of the fantasy literature. It has never worn out, and when you have to talk about it, we talk about the same, but I claim the fantastic as such that it hasn't be a zoological stronghold. I ask you to read the first written works of humanity, the first text of all. It's a great adventure, such as Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, there is not a single page, well, it's written on tables, of course, where there's no monster, or there is no fantastic element, and it's a compilation of all human passions. But if you then go to Homer, what shall we say? Cyclops and Sirens, and it's that. I have the impression that at the beginning, the literature as such was fantasy literature, because all elements were there. Then came somebody and wanted, I don't know how to tell it, to dignify literature, and took these things out and pushed them to the side, because I claim that because they are good as ever to talk about our society and just see it how in times of dictatorship the metaphor was used and the fantasy elements also to talk about the immediate reality. So I think we tend to it again as a cyclical element. There's a famous book from the city saying that writing from a realistic perspective is writing anachronically, because the reality is as it is, and we are better prepared if you read about other realities. As you make this claim of the fantastic, of fantasy, Mr. Pullman has the advantage of coming from a country where there is not so much stigma about fantasy, where you can study Mr. Martin at universities, or also the great pioneer of science fiction like Mary Shelley, about whom I'm still going to ask something. And here intelligence still raises its eyebrow. Why has the criminal novel normalized, and how having all these precedents, but having the new wave for 50 or 60 years, Michael Ende, who was criticized for allegedly escapist literature, and who still have to claim the fantasy novel. What's wrong? Perhaps we are rather much attached to realism, but all over Europe it's difficult to accept fantasy with all its normality, and this also explains Harry Potter and Martin. The Netflix generation is a generation that has no prejudice in audiovisuals, in TV series, in video games, but in literature we still are life partnering for fantasy. Is there a big stigma about it?
Yes, I think the stigma in English literature, British literature, is not so much towards fantasy as towards children's literature. There's a great snobbery on the literary pages of the press towards children's literature. And I think that's unjustified for all sorts of reasons. Partly because what children read is very important. It's very important for them. It's important for the future of our culture, of our understanding of ourselves. I have found a great freedom in writing books which seem to expect to be read by children. I never say this book is for children. I never say this book is for people with one leg, or people with red hair, or people who come from Sunderland. I never say that sort of thing. I want to welcome as many readers as I possibly can. But I know that a large number of my readers are children, and I enjoy that very much, because the audience which contains children but doesn't consist entirely of children, an audience that contains children and adults and young people and old people and very old people, grandparents and infants as well, that is the audience I like most of all. But that's the audience which is constantly ignored by the important critics, ignored but looked down on by the celebrated writers, which actually gives writers like me a great deal of freedom. Because few critics are listening to what I say, I can get away with saying things that would be harder to get away with if I were writing purely for adults. And I know that the book, His Dark Materials, has found an audience among more adult readers because it was published as a children's book than it would ever have found if it was published as an adult fantasy. Because children read it and they say, Mama, Daddy, I want to talk about this book, you must read it as well. Whereas if it was published as an adult fantasy, it would only go on the shelves which are devoted to fantasy. And adults are very set in our ways, and we know we don't like fantasy, we know we do like books about crime. So we only go to the shelves where the books about crime are, we ignore the fantasy shelves. Children have our eyes are more interested by all kinds of things, are less snobbish in the things they want to read about. So I'm very lucky to have that audience. But it still feels a little bit as if you write books for children, well, they're not very important books. They're not books worth our attention, really.
Well, this is a very interesting question, because I've made efforts to understand why this marginalization in our case, both of youth and children's literature and the fantasy genre. And my answer is that this is due to university, Catalan Spanish University. Academia, the academics are very conservative people here, at least regarding literature. They consider there are things that are not worth studying because it didn't appeal to them. And for things we should rather talk about how universities such as how they get subsidies for their departments. So this is fully stigmatized here. Fantasy genre. I think also that it has been a faculty in academia, especially backwards looking, and very little porous. In fact, the texts coming to academia have been changed, and that's terrific. And a text with fantasy elements that was read by the youth was the Quixote. But what occurred with the Quixote? And reading them without prejudice, you'll find fantasy elements there. You'll find especially comical elements, because there is a joke from the 17th century, and the king saw a young individual reading a book and laughing. He said, either this boy is crazy or is reading a Quixote. But you'll never listen an academic talk in these terms of the Quixote. They take out the joke, the funny things. It's like, look at all these episodes. It has to be very serious, exactly that way around than the intention of the author. And it's a process of historical conquest and texts entering the faculty. And by the way, it has more powerful than what I thought, because it's them who told it. So they have much power, at least on the continent. I think in the Anglo-Saxon world it's different, to decide what texts are the canonic and official ones and which not. And this is why there is a big difference between the public, the commons, so to say, and what is done in universities. And go there as a listener and you'll hear it, but you know it better than we as a journalist. But it's really a pity, because it's a full disconnection between reality and academia.
If I can add something there, academic critics enjoy talking about books which allow their own theories to be spoken about with great freedom. They like books which allow their own theories to work on them. But a theory is like a filter, it's like a photographic filter. A theory shows you certain things in a picture which, if you put a filter on the camera, a yellow filter on a black and white film, it shows you certain things more clearly and other things less clearly. If you put a red filter on, it shows you different things clearly, and that's what a theory does. So if you look at, for example, a work of English literature like Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, through the filter of Marxist theory, you can see certain things in the story which are there. It's not the filter, the theory putting them there. They are there in the story, but the filter shows them to you more clearly. Similarly, if you look at it through psychoanalytic theory, it shows you other things in the story which are there. And if you look at it through the post-colonial theory, the same thing happens. So academics like books which allow their theories, allow them to play their theories and put filters on the things they say about them. But when a new genre altogether comes along, and I'm thinking of, I don't know what the Spanish word is, but in France it's bande dessinée, the comics, graphic novels, that is completely puzzling to critics. It's mystifying because they don't know how to approach it. They're now beginning to understand it and beginning to say interesting things about it. But there will always be genre, always be new ways of telling stories which puzzle critics who are only used to having certain kinds of story to talk about.
It seems there is some academician here in the room, you're the exception, by the way. You were talking about humor, and humor in your work, I think, talking about filters and elements being stigmatized. In Albert's case, it's very present, especially in the tales. And in Philip Pullman's case, there are people who would discuss it, but I've always stated find intertextual irony throughout all your work. So I think that humor is an essential element. It is in Mr. Pullman's case. And also, Albert, why is humor good to you? It's like fantasy, to take a certain perspective and distance, without which it would be very difficult, right? Humor I think it's one of the most difficult things to do. In any genre, humor is very difficult. It's easier to have people cry than laugh. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But it's the comment I made before on a key element, which is respectability. Regarding academia, there is a long way to reach respectability for a text or an author, or even, as Philip said, for a genre. The graphic novel, comic strip, bande dessinée, tell it as you want. It's just another format of telling a story like any other. And I would like to remember one thing: a free format in the history of narrative, human narrative, is quite recent. For 500,000 years, the only genre was oral literature, and people told tales perfectly. And I, as an anthropologist, I've looked at human communities with only oral literature, and I can tell you one thing: humor is a key of oral literature, and it's very interesting because the narrative structure is different. For 500,000 years, we've had a different structure than that provided by the book, and that's very interesting. It would be too long to explain, but our narrative, with or without humor, is based on the three Aristotelic acts. It's the so-called primitive oral world. It's two acts, and it's very difficult to explain the revolution this meant. When we tell a story, it's three acts. That means a gentleman is very angry with a white whale because he had got the leg amputated. Second act, he looks for the whale to kill it. And third act, the whale kills the gentleman. That's it. In the previous literature, for most part of human time, we've had a history told. It's two acts. I took it from the Pygmies, but I was an anthropologist, but also a narrator. And one of my first questions was, how do we tell stories? Well, we do two acts instead of three. Well, he told me differently. The way of telling a story is Pygmies imitate a gorilla. And the story is a Pygmean finds a gorilla in the forest. They get in conflict, and the gorilla runs behind the Pygmean. And the third act for us would be, and how does this end? No, that's it. It's frustrating, isn't it? It's very frustrating because the social end of literature is different, because the question as an anthropologist is what occurs to the gorilla. The answers don't matter because we're all drunk. I mean, they have their party, and the literature has served its social utility, and they don't care at all if the captain kills the white whale or the Pygmean kills the gorilla. But this, we've marginalized humor. We've made it a part of our small histories. My experience as an anthropologist says that the narrative prior to written literature was totally different.
That's extremely interesting, and thank you for that illustration. It was very, very good, very funny. What you said about revolutions interests me. It seems to me that there have been 5 great revolutions in human communication since the very earliest days. First was when we learned to talk. You can say something. There's a tiger outside the cave. Tiger, cave, outside the cave. There's a tiger. And language comes with all sorts of other possibilities. We can say that there was a tiger outside the cave. The tiger is now gone. It allows us to talk about the future and the past as well. That was the first great revolution, language itself. Then came writing, making marks on something which is permanent, so you don't have to be in the presence of the storyteller to get the story. You can read it on a tablet or on a stone or on a scroll. That was the second one, writing. The third one, of course, was printing, where you could make many, many copies of something, like the Bible, and disseminate them in languages all over the world. The fourth revolution, it seems to me, was the movies, when for the first time we could see in pictures only, silent pictures to begin with, pictures only, we could see time passing. Until then, pictures were still, a picture only has a present tense. But in movies, we can have a past tense, we can have a future. And the fifth revolution, which we are in the middle of now, is, of course, the digital revolution and the revolution of the internet. We don't know where this will lead. Now, there are two things that seem to me to follow from this. First of all, they come much more quickly. It took thousands of years before we invented writing. 1,000 or 2,000 years before we invented printing. A few hundred years before we invented the cinema. 100 years before we invented the internet. So these things are coming very quickly, more and more quickly. And the second thing that seems to me important is we cannot tell what the consequences of these revolutions will be. When Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press in, 1470-something in Mainz in Germany, he could not have guessed, nobody could have guessed, that one of the consequences of this would have been the Protestant Revolution. But only 30, 40 years later, Martin Luther nailed his theses on the door of Wittenberg Church, and very soon they were printed, and the Bible was printed in the vernacular, and an enormous revolution came about because of the printing press. And neither Gutenberg nor the early printers in England or anywhere else could have predicted the results of that. Now, we can't predict the results of the revolution we're in the middle of now. It's a very extraordinary time in many ways, politically and culturally, and this is one of the ways in which it's a revolutionary time.
As you mentioned this, of not to know how it ends because you don't need to take a learning from a story. The question is why you were attacked. Why did Mr. Pullman was Mr. Pullman attacked for an allegedly anti-religious message, or why should you be attacked by the dictators and the disciples for the monster clown? But you provide social thought, you talk of inequality, of intolerance. Where is the limit between making committed literature and fantasy literature, which seems to be contradiction, and not wishing to convey a message, which was these things of the two parts? Because it's supposed that providing a message makes worse fantasy literature. How do you do it? Because after all, you want to talk. Mr. Pullman, his new trilogy, didn't want to talk about the other face with an artisan, and not the face of the elites, but the more popular face. And you, in different novels, wish to talk about this inequality. Is there any message or is there not? Why do you write?
I write to tell a story. If there is a message in it, it is because I am a human being and a citizen and a member of a liberal democracy in which I have certain responsibilities as a citizen, certain rights and also certain privileges, certain duties, and I'm very conscious of these. Now, when I write a long story, and His Dark Materials is a long story, it took me 7 years, when you take on a task like that, you cannot, psychologically, you can't do it in a frivolous, light-hearted way. It's a serious task. You have to take it seriously. And when you are engaged in doing something seriously, every part of you is engaged. Your moral nature is very much part of what you do. It can't be otherwise, because we are moral beings. We have a moral sense. And if we're doing something serious and deep and long, it'll take us a long time, inevitably our own preoccupations, our own convictions, our own beliefs and our own understandings will find themselves inevitably in the work we produce. I don't think we have any choice about it. So it's not a matter of choosing to write a particular message. It's a matter of the message appearing, whatever one chooses to do.
Right. Regarding my personal experience, I think that political powers, modern political instances, are very unafraid of any sort of literature. They only mobilize and attack when a specific book refers to somebody something specific, or they believe that they refer to somebody something specific. For instance, I can't go to Equatorial Guinea because I wrote a book on African dictators, and every chapter was a different dictator, and the only dictator who was still alive when I wrote it was that of the former Spanish colony of Equatorial Guinea. And I'm not going to travel there just in case, because I know how their mood is. But just, if you don't know it, that article wasn't written by me, but at a person who, precisely because they had written one of these books, he didn't want to appear as co-author. Well, the world is very large. Well, I sacrifice my visit to Equatorial Guinea. But I've had some persecution, but not because I've used any metaphoric monster, but precisely out of a book of historic novel, which is not the case of discussion we're having today. But some of you know that the Spanish embassy in Holland censored me directly, a cultural act that scandalized all Holland. But this demonstrates the power of literature, I think. Not only that, but the weakness of the political power, of some political powers who feel attacked because a novel in 21st century in Western Europe. But while we keep with the metaphoric value of the fantasy element and monstrosity, political powers will not intervene, usually not. It's the weak ones. Political power attacking novel, it's weak, but in the 21st century it's unthinkable. But we're in a fully irregular situation. If I say something different, I could be claimed, well, I don't know why you talk about these things, hey. But it's like that. It's terrible. Because we're having a discussion between fantasy and reality. I think that was to the point. As we have little time, I can't leave aside the Frankenstein subject. It's the bicentennial, but it's a subject that unites you for different, out of different views. The thought of the monster you make, that magic night where the vampire and Frankenstein came up, but more specifically, one of the few absolute references of the Philip Pullman's work is The Lost Paradise and Milton, which are very important in Frankenstein. Mary Shelley and Frankenstein.
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is, of course, a fundamentally important work in the history of literature and specifically of fantasy, because it shows the first application of science, or what she understood as science, to a story of monsters and fear and darkness and so on. It's a wonderful novel. But I'd like to come back, if I may, briefly to the question of politics again and language. It seems to me that totalitarian societies do not know how to read. They read in a very literal way, just like the fundamentalists of the southern states of America. The Bible is literally true. God created the world in 6 days. That is the way they read. They have no understanding of allegory, of metaphor, of irony, of all these things with which we enrich our texts and which we as readers have learned to understand texts. A perfect example of this and a horrible example came in Saudi Arabia a few years ago. There was a fire in a girls' school. You probably remember the story. And the policeman who was on charge refused to let the girls come out into the road because the instructions said girls must not leave the school without their proper dress on. And there was a fire. They were going to die. Doesn't matter. They haven't got the proper dress on. They can't come out. So the girls died. That's an example of how not to read. That's an example of how a totalitarian society thinks reading should be performed. It just came to mind then, and I was put in mind of that example. There's a wonderful book called Reading Lolita in Tehran by Azar Nafizi, who talks again about this literal mindedness of the theocratic society she was part of, a society not knowing how to read. This is one of the things that fantasy does allow us to bring to books, to stories. these elements of irony and self-contradiction and mystery and uncertainty, which are so much of the part of a liberal education in Western Europe and have been, but not so much the way that the fundamentalists would like to have it, whether they're fundamentalists of the left or the right or the religious or political sort.
No, a veure, a mi
There is an element which I like very much is the monsters as such, and I would like to ask for a thought. How difficult it is to create a monster in literature, because it has big advantage. When you create a monster, it follows the rules you have created as an author, but it's very difficult that they are kept over the time. Just see, if you look at the different monsters you know, I don't think it will reach for 2 hands. The vampires, Frankenstein, the mummy, werewolf. Why? Because they all zombies, exactly. And Frankenstein reached that. We could be talking the whole evening about Frankenstein, but when a monster is consolidated, so to say, it's because it invokes something from within ourselves and from our reality, not from a fantasia world that is beyond. A little time ago, a sociologist told me something that is very tenebrous. He said, the years of wealth, of economic prosperity, proliferate, have the vampire novels proliferate, while in times of crisis those are zombies. The psychological explanation, it's the sociologists, not mine, is that in the years of wealth, okay, things are going well, but there's somebody who is sucking our blood up there. And in case of absolute crisis and depletion, my neighbor can pinch everything from me because they're all foes and they come for me. And apparently this has been studied. On the other hand, the only thing I've heard of Philip minimally disagrees when he said that with technological change we don't know how this will influence in the genres and the industry of the book, because the other day I was with a very good German publisher, probably the one having the biggest publishing house, and he told me, Albert, we have the sales rates of books, and at the moment it got down like that, and we know exactly why. It was the moment when Netflix got into Germany. So it has a very strong influence with narrative and the genres and the formats where it's explained, either whether we like it or not.
Well, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that. But one thing that Netflix and the long-form television thing has, it's a novel's length. It's the length of a novel. You know, one little movie, 90 minutes or something, that's a short story. But a novel is a long thing, and if you put a whole of a novel, it's a box set, you know, it's a series and so on. So maybe Netflix is in the same business, in the same business as novelists.
En el fons són llenguatges narratius.
In the end, it's different narrative languages, but both Netflix and the novels, but Frankenstein could have made us talk about the wave of intolerance and authoritarianism that was after the French Revolution, and that made that Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a child of a monster for society of that time, and this made all this appear. So perhaps this relation between fantasy and reality could take us very far, but I would like to advance one subject that's interesting, because today in the authors of fantasy in the 21st century, perhaps in a very spectacular way, is world creation. Curiously enough, in your case, even though you come from have great universes, and I like very much Smolefa and its relation with the seeds to create a means of locomotion, but in your case, Stenton and Sinauka, and the relation the humans have of knowledge vis-a-vis a whole universe they view as the monster. But it's true that for you, the universe is probably not a priority, and otherwise, if I'm wrong, correct me, but for you, certain creatures and certain figures and the plot can be as important or more than this world. Am I wrong, or is it true?
No, a veure...
Well, what should I say?
És que, mira, estem... El món fantàstic aquest...
The world of fantasy we share, Philip and I, the big advantage is that fantasies as such, we want to be at least limited. Not even the limits of the universe. I think it was an Anglo-Saxon author who was in court, and he was asked what his limits are. He said, well, those are the dictionary. But another writer in the second trial said he didn't accept even that. I think this can be applied to fantasy. The nice thing is that the blank sheet is blank. And this is, to me, the big irrenounceable freedom. You can do whatever you please. Don't set any limits regarding genre critics and not even lesser religion. And I would like to comment to Philip, because what I liked about the Pygmies is that it was not a theist society, but it went a step further. If we had a cosmic inquiry of the society's universe, the Pygmies would strike, tick the box of they don't answer, and an anthropologist asked them, well, a missionary, sorry, but what do you believe created the forest, all the animals it contains, the sky, the soil and the moon? And the answer was, we don't know. And I think it's that. It's the attitude, it's absolutely the most liberal attitude of all. It's what you can apply to storytelling and fantastic. Do whatever you please. Don't let you set any limits.
That's quite right. And I enjoyed the Pygmies. My reason for writing fantasy is a very discreditable one. I'm very lazy. Going out and asking people things and going on journeys and looking things up, it's tiring. I like to sit in my room and just make it up. And I can make up anything I like because nobody can contradict me. I can say in my world electricity goes backwards or something, and nobody can say, well, you got it wrong, it doesn't. I say, it's my world, not yours. That's my reason for writing. It's one of my reasons for writing fantasy. But also because, more seriously, it enables me to isolate, as I began by saying, isolate certain aspects of the world and make them stand out more clearly. I've enjoyed all kinds of different fantasies, but the ones I enjoy most, like Frankenstein, do have a certain basis in reality. And I don't mean, in her case, the scientific basis, because as we know, you cannot bring a corpse to life by sewing it together and passing electricity through it. What I like about Frankenstein is the way she talks about education in particular. When the monster comes alive and looks around him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes, and then he disappears, and he goes to hide, and he spends some time hiding with a little family in the Alps and listening to them and watching what they do, and it's a process of education. It's a wonderful description of how the monster gradually comes to an understanding of things through imitation, through observation, and at first the monster is a moral being. He's good, he wants to help people, he wants to love them, he wants to share this love that they have, but because he looks so horrible, they flee from him in fear. And again, that's an educative thing. That's, for me, is when fantasy comes most fully alive, when it does use these great, wonderful tools that fantasy has to talk about reality. I think that's the most important thing. Fantasy is the most wonderful genre. It has the most extraordinary range of possibilities. We need to devote that, to dedicate it to something that's real, I think.
Parafrasejant Borges.
Paraphrasing Borges, and without wishing to offend anybody's work, but we could say that God is one of the biggest productions of fantasy of all history. In Mr. Pullman's case, when he wrote about these subjects, I asked to Albert and religion and God from all this perspective and this scientific basis of his books, and books on science can be written reading only an apparently youth anthology. What it makes me think is the evolution that has come about, in the sense that Philip Pullman wrote a trilogy, then a book, very vehemently, even though it was fiction, which is Good Jesus and Evil Christ. And in this new trilogy, and here we link up to the future project, where I am going to ask Albert, there is a little nuance, which is the fact of wishing to distinguish between having religious people who are good, but the problem is the institution, the power and the manipulation.
That's exactly right, yeah. The religious impulse, which I take to be the based in curiosity. What is this world? Who created it? The pygmies might not be very curious, but I am very curious, and I think it's a religious impulse. Did anyone create us? What must I do? What happens when we die? What happens? Do we go somewhere? Do we stay alive? Do we vanish? These are religious questions, and they're part of human nature. They're part of what makes us human. And I don't argue with that at all. But what I argue with, and where the danger appears, is when religion acquires political power, whether it's politics on a grand scale, or whether it's politics with a small p, politics in the family, in the context of the family. When somebody does something political for a religious reason, that's dangerous. That's when we should say, whoa, stop. What's your reason for doing this? And that's why even a society like Soviet Russia, which was like the Soviet Union, which was explicitly atheist, was nevertheless religious in that sense. It had a holy book, the works of Marx and Lenin. It had a priesthood. It was the Communist Party. It had a teleological view of history. History is moving towards a great salvation, towards the dictatorship of the proletariat. So if you're on the side of history, you're good, and if you're against history, you're bad, and you must be put down. There were devils and demons like the bourgeois. There was even a cult of holy relics. There was the bodies of Lenin and Stalin laid out in Red Square. People would go on pilgrimages to see them. In every respect, it was a religious society, except that it didn't believe in God. So you don't need God to be a religious society. Well, the problem is always political power, or religious power in the guise of politics, and disguised as politics. That's the problem.
In the case of the new book, you see very clearly in the whole Alexander's Lake. So if you read it, well, you will come to the end, and I will ask to have the final text read. Then I'll make you an last question of the text. What can we announce from both parts? What is left of the trilogy? And in your case, do you have also projects to be published? When talking about trilogies, everybody wish to read the third possible part of the Cold Skin, Pandora and Congo, but we'll have probably more material. Where are you heading to? Well, the literary world is full of commonplaces and sad phrases, but some of them exist because they are true. And one of these phrases says that it's the books that decide when they are written. Now, that's true. I would like to finish for one time for all this trilogy, which has been in my head, but, well, other projects have come in between. I'm very slow writing. I was with Victus and the continuation of Victus, and in between another novel came in, which is fantasy again. It will be called Fungus. It will be issued this autumn when the mushrooms grow. Ha ha ha. But again, the monster helps me talk about a very human, real thing, not the religious power, but the political power. Power, as such, has always interested me a lot. It has always been my obsession. Why do we obey? Why do we follow the authorities? That's an invention. It's a social construction. If there have been societies where they didn't exist, where there was no religious nor political institutions, some humans obey others, and to do what? How does that mechanism work? And the fantasy element can help me understand, and I'm really wishful to work on that and that it's published. And in the case of the trilogy, for the readers here, we have still 2 parts left. What can we say?
The second part is written, but it's too long, and I'm editing at the moment, which involves cutting. Then, of course, I shall start the third part. I don't know what's going to happen in the third part yet, but that's never been a problem to me so far. I hope I find an answer to this question. But no, in this second trilogy, I've become more and more involved in the matter of what the great English poet William Blake called vision. He meant imagination, the kind of thing that dictatorships don't like, the kind of thing that they don't like reading, they don't understand it. All these other things, these different dimensions, I mentioned irony, humor, all those things. Do they build up a true picture of what's there, or are they just fantasy? Are they just irrelevant? Does science alone and only science give us a true picture of reality, or does also literature matter and history matter and poetry matter? Well, I think you can see what my answer would be, and that's what I'm trying to dramatize and bring in front of my own understanding as I write these second and third parts of this trilogy. I mentioned William Blake. He's been had a profound effect on me from when I was a boy of 16. A liberating effect, an intoxicating, both his illustrations and his poetry set my mind on fire when I was 16 years old. And I'm always be grateful to William Blake for that, and always honor his name and seek to carry out the kind of thing that he would understand and approve of.
Doncs llegirem el darrer fragment.
We'll read out the last part of this section, La pell freda, The Cold Skin of Albert Sánchez Piñol.
Al far em vaig fer aquesta pregunta infinites vegades. Quan m'inflamava el desig i just després de tenir-la, abans i després de cada salt, quan el sol sortia i quan es ponia. M'ho preguntava cada vegada que una onada cansada arribava a les nostres platges. Des del balcó veia el mar i aquesta extensió que sempre havíem cregut buida, i la meva imaginació expandia totes les potències per preguntar-se: qui ets? Què hi fas aquí? Mai sabria res d'ella. Estava condemnat a aquesta ignorància primordial. Entre ella i jo s'estenia una distància inimaginable. Formava part d'una comunitat d'éssers que vivien sota els oceans. Tota la meva fantasia era impotent a l'hora de concebre el seu món, vida quotidiana i trivialitats, els principis que regien la seva existència. Com podria entendre els conflictes que l'enfrontaven als seus? Com entendria mai les seves frustracions, les seves derrotes? Mai sabria què la va dur a amagar-se al far. Això era tan impossible com que ella arribés a entendre els motius que havien dut fins allà a un irlandès desertor. Abans d'arribar al far, la meva ànima s'havia mogut per viaranys torturosos. Si acceptava la possibilitat que ella fos una igual a mi, també havia d'assumir que la seva vida s'hagués mogut per camins equivalents, sí, però infinitament llunyans. Ignorava, fins i tot, si entre ells la paraula amor tenia algun contingut.
Llegiré per acabar un fragment de La brúixola daurada.
I'll read out a fragment of the Golden Compass.
Que s'anava enfosquint mentre miraven de mantenir-se a la mateixa banda, lluny del camp de visió de la cuina. Ja havien parat les 3 taules grans que ocupaven la llargada del menjador, La plata i el vidre resplendien malgrat la poca llum que s'escolava i havien separat els bancs de les taules que esperaven l'arribada dels comensals. La foscor no impedia que s'entreveiessin els retrats d'antics rascors que penjaven de les parets. La Lira es va acostar a la tarima, es va girar per observar la porta oberta de la cuina i, com que no va veure ningú, s'hi va enfilar. Es va apropar a la taula principal, la més alta, i va veure que l'havien parada en or i no en plata, i que no havien posat els bancs de roure, sinó 14 cadires de caoba amb coixins de vellut. Gràcies.
Vull acabar per part meva amb una pregunta.
I would like to finish with an untimely question and a question from the audience. My question has to do with the fact that I have found much water in your works. Water, submarine creature, the big deluge. And it's true that water is an important element in fantasy, but why this fascination for water? Perhaps because the underwater world is one of the last to be discovered, because the land had been discovered. Well, in this case, there's no secret. The ocean is such a big water mass and such unknown that what you can't fill with the eyes, you fill with imagination. And using the sea as a restless element is something easy. It's happened to all of us, but, well, I don't have a special fascination for it, but I've seen it very much. Well, I like swimming, yeah? I also like to cook, but I cook very badly. I mean, that you like one thing doesn't mean that you're good at it. And in your case, why the deluge?
When I was a boy of 8, 9 years old, we lived in Australia for about a year and a half. And at that time, it was 1956, there was a great flood in the southern states of Australia. And I remember being taken to look at this flood. My father put us in the car, and we drove out there and stood on the edge of a hill, on the side of a hill, looking across a valley which had been full of vineyards, of farms, of houses, of buildings, of villages, and there was nothing to be seen but an immense mass of water, grey water, and it was a cold day, there was a cold wind, and this was in Australia. A mass of water moving swiftly, inexorably from one side to another. I was so impressed by the power of this, the force, the unanswerability of this tremendous force, that it affected me very deeply, and I dreamed about it, I dream about it still, and I think that's what was lying behind the flood in my story. But a flood is very useful because it can smash old things down, it can stir up new things from the ground below. It's something that, like every other element of fantasy, a lens, a filter through which we see reality. And that's why I wrote about a flood.
Una pregunta.
One question from the audience. First-hand reason. Sorry, we need a microphone, otherwise we can't translate. Sorry about that.
Espera, que tens el micro.
As a writer, the adaptations of your work, particularly of the Golden Compass, after which the hair color changed, how does it affect to see your work on another platform as a writer? You've written and published. How do the change and things that don't change affect you?
Well, there are some things that matter and other things that don't matter very much, and the color of hair is one of the things that don't matter very much. It's always interesting to see one's work adapted, and especially if it's adapted well. Now, the Golden Compass, or Northern Lights as I call it, has been adapted many ways. It's been a movie, which was not very good. You shake your head as well.
They cut off the end.
Too many changes. It was too fancy, it was over-designed, it was all sorts of things. It's been a stage play at the National Theatre in London, which was very good. It's been a radio play, it's been a radio adaptation, it's now being made into a television adaptation. So these things happen. The most important thing to remember is that when they make a film of your book, there's no law that says your book, all the copies of your book must be gathered in and burned. The book is still there. Our common expectation now of our experience of the last 100 years of cinema, our expectation is that if there's a book we like and they make a film of it, we're going to be disappointed. We're not going to like it because he doesn't look like that and she never said that and they've changed the ending and, oh, I don't like the color of his clothes. You know, we expect to be disappointed. So when a film or an adaptation does come up that we do like, it's a pleasant surprise. But the money is good.
We're really looking forward to your TV show adaptation of.
I'm hoping that will be very good.
Podem fer dues coses, que estiguis fora de temps I no vulguis contestar.
We can have two things that we're out of time we don't answer, and that you can talk how it was the film. No, I don't want to answer. I'm sorry when I'm asked by a journalist, but you're getting in a tricky situation. Because if you liked it, you'll say it. If you don't like it, what can you say? Because people have been involved in the project, they have put much energy, resources and money into it. But things can work out badly. And when have you ever seen an author happy with a movie adaptation of his film, of his books? I think this will never change. Well, I think this doesn't compromise you in any ways. In a way, I think that one of the big disgraces of fantasy of the last times is that one of the best authors currently, which are two, are far from having acceptable adaptations. But this is an opinion of mine. Yes, but I want to say one thing in favor of the people who are not here, is that I've always thought that a writer is like a guerrilla fighter, and everything they do, it's under their responsibility. And the movie maker is a general. They have many people under their orders. Can't think how many people this involves, and it's easier to be a guerrilla fighter than a general. And I prefer to think of that. And can we expect something of the series, Mr. Pullman?
Well, I hope so. The danger is often the money. The more money is spent on something, the more anxious the creators are, the director, the producer, the more they want to interfere and make it different. I sometimes think that the best adaptation is going to be the cheapest. And somebody working on a kitchen table with paper and scissors and little puppets and string will make a better adaptation than a Hollywood studio with $200,000 million. But I might be wrong. But my experience is the more money involved, the more anxiety. And that anxiety does not lead to confident movie making or storytelling.
El meu comiat durarà 10 segons, Marina.
My farewell will stay 10 seconds. Sorry, can't take more questions. So these 10 seconds are to say that if you've read Philip Pullman, you know that one of the most important creatures are the daemonians, with all they represented mean. I've spent all life Mr. Pullman's daemonian. It's his books. I think I found them. So deal with them as if this were his consciousness, his soul, his essence. In Albert Sánchez Piñol's case, it would be very easy to say that he spends his life looking for the monster because he's a monster. I am saying it in a positive sense because everybody who knows me knows I can talk of monsters in a positive sense. Nevertheless, I would like to say that many years ago, the first tale with which I won prize, the big prize, it was won by him, with tale took the man who had an elephant's deposition on the TV set, and beyond that, What's good and nice about Albert Sánchez Piñol, this fear from Netflix, other languages, AV. I think that people who read like Albert Sánchez Piñol and Mr. Pullman, I think we still have much literature ahead. So thank you very much to both.